The coldest winter. As the amber leaves of October drifted from the maples, Elara bundled her scarf tighter, her breath fogging in the crisp morning air. Fall had arrived in the small mountain town of Vinterhollow, but it carried a sharper bite than she remembered. The wind, usually a playful rustle through the pines, now clawed at her cheeks with an unfamiliar menace. She trudged along the dirt path to her cabin, arms laden with firewood, sensing something amiss in the season's early chill. Elara had lived in Vinterhollow her entire life, 32 years of predictable winters. But this fall, the cold crept in too soon, too fierce. Frost dusted the fields by mid-September, and the lake's edges glittered with thin ice before Halloween. Townsfolk whispered in the general store, their voices low. Old-timers swore no winter had ever started like this. Elara dismissed their talk as exaggeration, but as she stacked logs by her hearth, she couldn't shake the unease settling in her bones. November arrived, and the cold deepened into something alive, malicious. Snow fell in heavy sheets, not the soft flakes of memory, but dense, wet curtains that buried paths overnight. Elara's cabin groaned under the weight, its windows frosted opaque. She burned through her woodpile faster than planned, the fire barely holding back the chill that seeped through the walls. Outside, the world turned alien, trees snapped under ice, their branches littering the ground like broken bones. The thermometer plummeted, 10 below, then 20, then lower still. By December, it stopped reading altogether, the mercury frozen in its glass. Elara ventured out only for necessities, her boots crunching through snowdrifts to the town square. The market was barren, supply trucks couldn't navigate the iced-over roads. Neighbors huddled in their coats, faces pale, sharing rumors of a winter that wouldn't relent. "It's unnatural," said old Mara, her eyes sharp despite her age. "The wind speaks. It's angry." Elara scoffed but felt a shiver unrelated to the cold. At night, the wind howled, carrying sounds like distant cries, and she dreamed of endless white, a void that swallowed warmth. January brought the worst. The sun, when it appeared, was a weak smear behind grey clouds. Power lines failed, leaving Vinterhollow in darkness. Elara's cabin became a cave of flickering candlelight, her breath visible indoors. She rationed her remaining wood, sleeping in layers of sweaters, her fingers numb even in gloves. The town's well froze solid, forcing her to melt snow for water. Each trip outside was a battle, her eyelashes crusted with ice, her lungs burning with every breath. The cold wasn't just weather, it was a presence, pressing against her, whispering surrender. One night, as the wind screamed louder than ever, Elara found a journal in her attic, left by her great-grandmother. Its pages spoke of a winter a century ago, the frost of 23, when the valley had nearly perished. "The cold tests us," it read. "It demands sacrifice, but unity binds us stronger than ice." Elara read by firelight, her heart pounding. The journal hinted at a ritual, a gathering to appease the winter's wrath, though the details were vague, something about fire, song, and shared will. Desperate, Elara rallied the townsfolk. They gathered in the square, shivering, their faces gaunt but determined. They built a bonfire, its flames defiant against the blizzard. They sang old songs, their voices trembling at first, then growing bold. Elara felt warmth, not just from the fire, but from the people around her, their shared resolve a shield against the cold. The wind's howl softened, as if listening. By dawn, the snow slowed. The sky cracked open, revealing a sliver of blue, The cold lingered, but its cruelty waned, as if the winter had exhaled its fury. Elara stood among her neighbors, exhausted but alive, the journal's words echoing in her mind. The coldest winter had tested them, but they had endured, not alone, but together. February descended on Vinterhollow like a predator, the cold tightening its grip until the air itself seemed to crack. The brief hope sparked by the town's bonfire ritual faded as the blizzard returned with vengeance, burying the square in drifts taller than Elara. Food dwindled, the general store's shelves, already sparse, now held only a few cans of beans and some stale crackers. Elara's own pantry was nearly bare, a sack of flour, half a jar of pickled beets, and a dwindling bag of oats. The town's hunters, usually reliable, couldn't venture far, the forest was a frozen labyrinth, and even the deer had vanished, as if the cold had swallowed them too. Elara woke each morning to a cabin so frigid her breath hung in clouds, her joints aching as she forced herself from her cocoon of blankets. The thermometer was useless, but she guessed it was 30 below, maybe worse. Opening the door was a gamble. Yesterday, the handle had burned her skin, the metal so cold it stuck to her palm, peeling away a strip of flesh. She wrapped her hands in rags now, but every trip outside felt like stepping into death's jaws. The wind cut through her layers, stinging her eyes until tears froze on her lashes. She limited her outings to fetching snow for water, each step a battle against the relentless chill. In town, whispers of desperation grew. Old Mara, her face gaunt, spoke of families eating boiled leather or pine bark. The Jensens, down the road, hadn't been seen in days, their chimney smokeless. Elara knocked on their door, her heart pounding, and found them huddled under blankets, too weak to stand. She shared her last bit of oats, knowing it might cost her later. "We can't give up," she told them, her voice firmer than she felt. But her own stomach growled, a hollow ache that kept her awake at night. The cold made everything harder. Fires burned weakly, devouring wood too fast. Elara's pile was nearly gone, and the forest was too dangerous to raid for more. The lake, frozen solid, offered no fish. Some talked of leaving, but the roads were impassable, the nearest city 100 miles through snow-choked passes. "We're trapped," muttered Tom, the blacksmith, his hands cracked and bleeding from frostbite. Elara saw fear in his eyes, a man who'd never flinched at hardship. One evening, as the wind howled like a living thing, Elara reread her great-grandmother's journal by candlelight. A passage caught her eye, half-faded, "When hunger gnaws and cold binds, seek the heart of the valley. The earth remembers warmth." It was cryptic, maddeningly vague, but it stirred something in her. The valley's heart, could it mean the old caves, tucked deep in the pines? Legend spoke of hot springs there, hidden but warm, a refuge in ancient winters. It was a long shot, but starvation loomed, and the cold was a slow executioner. Elara rallied a small group, Tom, Mara, and young Lila, whose optimism hadn't yet frozen. They bundled in every scrap of clothing, tying ropes to each other to avoid getting lost in the whiteout. The trek was brutal, snow swallowed their legs, and the wind screamed in their ears. Elara's lungs burned, her fingers numb despite mittens. After hours, they found the caves, their entrance nearly buried. Inside, the air was damp, warmer by degrees. A faint steam rose from a pool, its surface shimmering in the dark. They filled their canteens with warm water, a small miracle. Mara found edible moss, bitter but sustaining, clinging to the cave walls. Tom rigged a sled from branches to haul it back. It wasn't much, but it was hope, a spark to keep them going. As they trudged home, Elara felt the journal's weight in her pocket, its words a lifeline. The cold was merciless, but the valley held secrets, and she'd fight to uncover them. For now, they'd survive another day, tethered by wool and the faint warmth of the earth's heart. March arrived in Vinterhollow, but it brought no relief. The cold had become a malevolent force, a beast that gnawed at the town's spirit. Elara's pantry was empty, the last crumbs of flour and moss from the caves gone. The town's food was depleted, even the bitter pine bark had been stripped and boiled into a tasteless sludge. Firewood was scarcer still, Elara's stack was down to a handful of logs, each one burned sparingly, the cabin's warmth a fleeting memory. The air inside was barely above freezing, and she slept in every piece of clothing she owned, her breath a frosty cloud in the candlelight. Outside, the world was a tomb of ice. Snowdrifts swallowed homes to their rooftops, and the wind carved eerie shapes in the frost, like faces watching from the dark. The caves had offered a brief reprieve, but their moss was finite, and the trek was too perilous to repeat often. Elara's body ached with hunger, her ribs stark against her skin. The townsfolk were shadows of themselves, Tom's broad shoulders hunched, Mara's sharp eyes dulled, and young Lila's chatter silenced by exhaustion. The Jensens hadn't stirred in weeks, Elara feared the worst but lacked the strength to check. Yet, in the depths of despair, a stubborn spark flickered. Elara clung to her great-grandmother's journal, its pages worn from rereading. One line haunted her, "The coldest winters pass when hearts endure." It felt like a taunt, but she refused to let it break her. She gathered the townsfolk in the square, their faces gaunt under hoods and scarves. The bonfire was impossible now, too little wood, but they stood in a circle, sharing stories of past springs, of green fields and warm sun. Their voices, weak at first, grew steadier, weaving a fragile warmth that no fire could match. Elara proposed a plan, pool their strength to reach the caves again. The hot springs could sustain them, if only they could make it. They rationed their energy, tying ropes and moving as one through the blizzard. The journey was agony. Lila stumbled, her small frame nearly lost in the snow, but Tom hauled her up. Elara's legs burned, her vision blurring, but she thought of the journal, of endurance. After hours, they reached the caves, the faint steam a lifeline. They drank the warm water, chewed the last scraps of moss, and rested, the cave's damp warmth a sanctuary against the cold's claws. Back in Vinterhollow, they shared what little they'd gathered, a meager meal that staved off collapse. Days blurred, each one a battle to survive. Elara organized shifts, some tended the caves, others guarded the last embers of their fires. They sang when they could, their voices cracked but defiant, echoing the ritual that had once tamed the storm. Slowly, impossibly, the wind's howl softened. One morning, a faint glow pierced the clouds, the sun's light stronger than it had been in months. The snow didn't fall that day. By mid-March, the ice began to crack. Drips echoed from rooftops, and a trickle ran in a frozen stream. The cold lingered, but its grip loosened, as if the valley had exhaled. Elara stood outside, her face tilted to the weak sun, feeling its warmth for the first time in months. The town was battered, some homes lost, some lives gone, but those who remained stood together, their shared ordeal a bond stronger than the frost. Mara, her eyes regaining their spark, murmured, "We outlasted it." Elara clutched the journal, its words no longer a mystery. The coldest winter had tested them, stripped them to their core, but it had passed, as all tough times do. Vinterhollow would rebuild, scarred but alive, its people forged anew in the crucible of ice. Elara smiled, a small, hard-won thing, and began to plan for spring. The thaw of mid-March was a cruel tease in Vinterhollow, the brief trickle of melting snow refreezing into treacherous ice by nightfall. Elara's cabin, a frail fortress against the relentless cold, stood nearly empty of sustenance. The last scraps of cave moss were gone, and her stomach gnawed at itself, a constant ache that mirrored the hollow stares of her neighbors. Firewood was down to a single splintered log, its weak flame barely warming her frost-bitten fingers. The town clung to survival, buoyed by the faint hope of spring, but the winter's grip refused to fully relent. One dusk, as the sky bled grey, Elara heard a low, rumbling grunt outside her cabin. Peering through the frosted window, she saw it, a massive bear, its fur matted and ribs stark beneath its hide, sniffing the snow near her door. Its eyes, glinting in the dim light, held a desperate hunger she recognized too well. The beast pawed at the ground, likely drawn by the faint scent of the boiled bark Elara had choked down days ago. Her heart thudded, not from fear, but from a strange kinship. "You're starving too, aren't you?" she whispered, her breath clouding the glass. The bear circled the cabin, its heavy steps crunching the ice-crusted snow. Elara's first instinct was to bar the door, but the creature's gaunt frame stopped her. She knew that hunger, the way it clawed at the mind, fraying sanity. She'd caught herself staring at the cabin walls, imagining they might hide something edible, her thoughts slipping into dangerous loops. The bear's presence felt like a mirror, its survival as precarious as her own. She couldn't hate it for wanting to live. Still, she couldn't risk it breaking in. Elara grabbed her broom, its handle worn smooth, and cracked the door open, shouting to scare it off. The bear flinched, its head low, but didn't flee. Instead, it lingered, nosing at the snowbank where she'd dumped ash from the fire. Pity twisted in her chest, but she banged the broom against the doorframe, her voice hoarse. "Go on, there's nothing here." The bear snorted, retreating a few steps, but its eyes stayed fixed on the cabin, wary and pleading. That night, Elara lay awake, the wind's moan mingling with the bear's distant huffs. Hunger made her thoughts jagged, her mind teetering on the edge of despair. She clutched her great-grandmother's journal, its pages a lifeline. "All tough times pass," she muttered, the words a mantra against the creeping madness. She pictured spring, green shoots, flowing streams, the town alive again. It felt distant, but she forced herself to believe it, to hold onto sanity for one more day. By morning, the bear was back, closer now, its snout pressed against a crack in the shed where Elara had once stored grain. She watched from the window, torn between fear and empathy. She had nothing to give, yet the bear's persistence stirred her. If it could keep searching, so could she. Elara rallied Tom and Lila, their faces skeletal but determined, and they trekked to the caves again. The journey was brutal, the cold biting through their rags, but they returned with a handful of moss and a few frozen roots, enough to quiet their stomach screams. Elara left a small pile of roots outside, far from the cabin, hoping the bear would take them and move on. It did, snuffling the offering before vanishing into the pines. She watched it go, a flicker of relief mingling with her exhaustion. The cold, the hunger, the bear, they were all trials, but she'd faced them. Vinterhollow was battered, but its people were stubborn. Elara whispered to the empty cabin, "We'll outlast this," her voice steady despite the ache. The bear, like her, was fighting to survive, and spring, however faint, was coming. April crept into Vinterhollow, and with it, the iron grip of winter finally loosened. The snow, once an unyielding tyrant, began to retreat, melting into rivulets that carved paths through the icy crust. Elara stepped outside her cabin one morning, her boots sinking into slush, and felt a warmth she'd almost forgotten, a soft, golden glow from a sun no longer shrouded in grey. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth, the promise of life stirring beneath the frost. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth kiss her face, her chapped lips curving into a smile. It felt like waking from a long, brutal dream. The bear hadn't returned since it took the routes Elara left, its tracks lost in the melting snow. She hoped it had found its own salvation, just as Vinterhollow was finding its. The valley began to transform, green shoots pierced the thawing soil, and the stream near the town square gurgled with fresh water. The lake's ice cracked, revealing fish that flashed silver in the sunlight. Tom, his strength slowly returning, rigged nets and pulled in enough to share, their smoky flavor a feast after months of starvation. Lila, her eyes bright again, gathered wild greens sprouting near the caves, her laughter echoing like a forgotten song. Food became plentiful, not in abundance but enough to silence the gnawing hunger. The townsfolk bartered what they could, roots, fish, early berries plucked from thawing bushes. Old Mara, her hand steadier, baked flatbread from flour sent by a supply truck that finally breached the pass. Elara's pantry, once a barren crypt, held jars of preserved fish and dried herbs, each one a small victory. The warmth of spring seeped into the cabin, chasing out the chill that had clung to the walls. She no longer needed every sweater, and the fire, now a luxury, crackled gently rather than desperately. The town gathered in the square, not for survival but to celebrate. They shared a meal under the open sky, their faces no longer gaunt, their voices weaving stories of the winter's trials. Elara stood among them, her great-grandmother's journal tucked in her coat, its words, "All tough times pass," proven true. The coldest winter had been a crucible, stripping them to their bones, but they had endured. Tom raised a cup of spring water, toasting their resilience, and Lila led a song, her voice carrying over the valley. Even the wind, once a howling beast, now rustled gently, as if in apology. Elara walked to the caves one last time, not for moss but to feel the hot spring steam, a reminder of the earth's hidden warmth that had sustained them. The valley bloomed around her, wildflowers dotting the hills, proof that perseverance paid off. She thought of the bear, of her own hunger, of the nights she'd clung to sanity by a thread. Those moments felt distant now, softened by the sun's embrace. Vinterhollow was scarred, some homes still stood empty, some faces missing, but it was alive, its people bound by a shared triumph. As she returned to her cabin, Elara paused to watch the sunset, its colors vivid against the greening pines. The warmth on her skin was a gift, the fullness in her belly a miracle. She whispered to the journal, to the valley, to herself, "We made it." Spring had arrived, and with it, the certainty that no winter, however cruel, could outlast their will to survive. The end.